Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be sponsored by the FPL Cartel, and it's going to be the Game Week 9 cheat sheet. But on a serious note, the Sun assist was removed, and my green arrow has turned into a red one, which is fine. It was basically a gray arrow, around 1.9x million in the world, 1.93, and that's that. As far as the cheat sheet series, if you've never seen it before, it's a series where we look at all the different price points in FPL and look ahead towards projecting what are the best players at each price point. And generally, I'll go through my discussions of players based on my understanding of the tactics, the minutes so far, and fixtures lying ahead, as well as third-party available data. A lot of the data is also supported by Fantasy Football Hub, so it's a fantastic tool that you can have a look at the link in bio, which has all the advanced stats that I share for the purposes of these videos. And of course, I'm looking ahead to sort of expected points algorithms from Fantasy Football Hub, and there's a lot of other tools that can help your team specifically, like suggested transfers. So do have a look at the link in bio below, where you will get 30% off for Fantasy Football Hub and a subscription up until the end of December. So let's quickly jump into the midfield segment of the cheat sheet. No real changes here other than I took out Fabio Carvalho. I think with Wisa coming back, which was actually a little bit of an early shock, that's just going to mean that the minutes of players like Sade and Carvalho are definitely going to be quite suspect. Buonanotte, however, has risen. He's been extremely hot in form. Underlying stats really, really good, considering that he still plays for Leicester, and ultimately seems like a very, very solid pick to go for. His minutes have also just shown to be very consistent within the recent games, and although I still think that Steve Cooper is a manager that's quite hard to guess, Leicester are in a really good position where ultimately they've been winning games, they've secured a lot of points on the board, and I can't see him changing too many things in the near future, which makes Buonanotte a very, very good pick. No real other changes in terms of the budget midfielders. As far as players like even McNeil, Semenyo, Smith-Rowe, a little bit more expensive 5.5 plus midfielders, no changes there too. I think with Semenyo, you're just going to have to see out the next two fixtures. He's arguably still a bench or someone that you reluctantly play if you want to. Bournemouth have shown to be an extremely competitive team so far, and not just because they were able to capitalize on a 10-man Arsenal, but yeah, ultimately a lot of the statistics that we've seen with Bournemouth under Iraola have been extremely impressive, particularly from the offensive point of view. As far as Smith-Rowe, his minutes still look really good. I'm not that concerned about Fulham and, you know, I guess the poor performance versus Aston Villa. We know that there's going to be some tough games in the distance, but Fulham have, generally speaking, been a very, very strong team anyways. And moving on to the sort of 6.x tier, we finally have some significant changes. I've given Kulusevski a rise. Part of this is because looking at Tottenham and that sort of tactical change within the previous West Ham match, you just have to read into it that Kulusevski is so much more important to the team right now than someone like Maddison. And arguably you can see that, you know, someone like Sarr can come into the pitch, replace Maddison as a tactical change, and Kulusevski stays on and is still a very, very central part of that team. What I've always criticized Kulusevski for has been poor underlying data, and this season that's actually been markedly improved. So when you look at, for example, some of the underlying stats for Johnson and Johnson, or Johnson from last season to Johnson this season, and Kulusevski last season to this season, it's interesting that Kulusevski's actually, you know, had a huge tick up, and he himself has talked about how he's improved with his sort of training regimen and work ethic. So it is quite impressive, and I think that's really, it really does bode well considering the minutes are good for him finally, and also that ultimately this run of games is really good for Tottenham. So both of these picks I still really, really like. Garnacho gets his sort of reintroduction into the cheat sheet. We've had Man United midfielders here before. I've been accused of Man United bias, but the reality is that the fixture run that they have within the distance is still quite strong, right? West Ham, Leicester, these are good games. The Chelsea game, at least, is also at home. And if there's anything that United are quite decent at, it's probably both ends of the pitch, to be honest, where they're actually a bit of a mid-table side. But Garnacho is someone who, for the sort of price point, for the underlying stats that he have, he's actually a really, really strong pick. And I think he's someone that I have a little bit more faith in with the minutes compared to someone like Rashford, who we know that he can hit some very high highs, but also some pretty low lows. And I think Garnacho is a little bit more solid considering he's also a cheaper option anyways. And when you look at the United fixture run, I mean, that's something that you could possibly invest into at that sort of price point. So I think Garnacho definitely deserves a reintroduction here. Eze has been given a drop. It's a similar situation to United, where I can see a lot of people looking at teams like Crystal Palace and United and simply saying that, you know, these are some of the worst teams of the league in terms of the performance, the play style, you know, how it looks like watching a Crystal Palace game. I just came off of watching Crystal Palace versus Nottingham Forest, probably one of the worst games I've seen so far. In terms of underlying data so far as well, Man United sit comfortably mid-table, considering the sort of runs of games that they've had. Nottingham Forest a little bit higher above that, and Crystal Palace, once again, another slightly poor performance that actually moves them closer to the bottom half of the table, which is, I mean, exactly what you would expect from a team so far that has 3 draws and around 5 losses. So yes, Crystal Palace have played really poorly. I don't think they've necessarily been so bad on defense like a Southampton, a Wolves, a Leicester, or an Ipswich, but they've played really poor on offense, and they're comfortably one of the worst offenses within the league. We've always categorized a team like Crystal Palace as a bottom offense, and Nottingham Forest and even Everton are there, but we continue to look at picks from Everton or Nottingham Forest. So I think the jury is not to say that Eze is completely dead as a pick, but simply he's still taking a lot of pot shots. You could argue that maybe that XG is not very rewarding. He hasn't gotten a penalty like Mateta has so far. His minutes are still perfect, and ultimately the team has not been clicking. Is this run of fixtures still very good for Eze? I would say yes, but I can totally understand why people want to switch off of Eze, considering that there has been a small, drop in terms of the underlying stats as well, and that's been evident within the NPXG from last season to this season. On the other hand, I think there's been a significant increase for Mitoma, right? Mitoma is someone who has actually benefited under Fabian. Fabian is actually about to head into a pretty poor run of games for Brighton, but you do have a Wolves at home fixture here. I can understand why someone might be intrigued by Mitoma, but you do have to look at 10-11 as Liverpool and Man City. After that, though, the fixture run is actually very smooth for Brighton. So I can understand maybe some people may be interested in going for a differential here, looking at someone like Mitoma, who's actually had really good underlying stats this season and has really solidified his minutes so far for this Brighton team. So that's an interesting pick. Savinho is also someone who I find very hard to judge right now, because I talked about why I dropped him even ahead of these really good games on paper for City. And City did look pretty poor versus Wolves from an attacking perspective. They've also continued to lose their clean sheets, but that's not really relevant for the attackers. The point is that Savinho actually did start in that game, and he was subbed at round about the time that we expect him to be subbed off for. But Foden was the player who was once again sitting on the bench. And there will be, let's say, Champions League fixtures coming up for Man City, and there's going to be rotation. So if I was a Savinho owner, I would be looking at the Champions League as an indication of what the minutes could be. I think if he, for example, starts within the Champions League game, I'm probably actually expecting that he could get benched versus Southampton, because now there's a little bit more depth in the team. I'm not so sure about whether KDB is going to be available for the weekend, but that can have an impact on, who plays inside minutes, whether Bernardo Silva is someone who actually shifts out wide and things like that. At the same time, Trossard gets a drop. These Arsenal fixtures are just much, much worse. And so we're trying to put some context into that. Plus, of course, he made a key mistake in the previous game. I don't think Arteta is the type of manager who'd punish a player like that. But with, let's say, Merino also coming into the team, we're starting to see less minutes for some of the other players, even with Saka being out. And so that's why Trossard is going to get the drop. At the 7.x position, we get a Bowen rise. So Bowen has just shifted off a tough fixture on paper versus Tottenham away that was, and ultimately the run of games Knicks are actually very clean. Man United at home and Everton at home are nice games. Nottingham Forest away is now generally for I think most people looking at the league, understandably a poor game. I'd still say that looking at the Palace game, teams can still get chances versus Nottingham Forest. I don't think they're an absolute brick wall, for example, and neither would I say that Nottingham Forest are, let's say, a top 3, top 4 defense in the league, but they have played like it so far, considering the fixture slate that they've had. So that's a credit to them, but ultimately, I think West Ham and Bowen, this is still the sort of run that you'd like to project ahead and actually own a player like Bowen for. So I think he definitely deserves a rise. Martinelli suffers from some similar issues to Trossard. He also had a bit of doubts coming back from the international break. So that's why he's still a differential pick. Gordon and Maddison also sort of fall into this tier. Gordon has been a differential for a while, just simply because I don't like the Newcastle fixtures. But Maddison has gotten that drop because of that tactical sub versus West Ham. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to see that tactical sub every game. I'm not even saying that Maddison necessarily is someone who's going to have his minutes vastly reduced, but I think we've already opened to the possibility that that could happen. And considering that you have other players in other price points that can actually give you a lot more value, that maybe players like Son and Solanke are still people that I would hold in priority as the penalty taker. That for me just calls into question why Maddison's necessarily worth it with an FPL in this context. And I'd say the upper threshold of his minutes is something like 75, 80 minutes a game. If he can be someone who could be benched, or even someone who could be subbed off at 45 minutes, that's why Maddison deserves a drop. Bruno gets a rise. He's ultimately the flip side of that, right? Someone who is probably playing for a much more inferior team when we look at the offense, but is playing perfect minutes, and we still know he's on penalties. So whilst I know a lot of people will struggle to sort of grasp the idea of why I'm giving Bruno a rise, but ultimately it's a case of United have still, for the most part, when you look at underlying data, actually look decent on offense compared to, let's say, Crystal Palace or some of the other teams that we've mentioned as well, who find themselves very close to the bottom of the table in terms of expected goals. Bruno's underlying stats have not been too far short of what it was last season, where he was still a very much relevant pick in FPL, and so I'm going to give him a rise here. Foden is a weird one, where of course he's played so few minutes this season. I don't think it's correct to just judge him by his NPXG and his NPXGI more specifically when you look at this sort of combined column here. But it's very clear that he might not be fitting necessarily in the system, but you could probably make the same argument for Haaland if you were just watching the last 3 fixtures of football. City were also playing Rodri-less for the start of the season, but had some great results. Haaland had some great XG. I can also probably say that for Foden, whilst this team has been struggling, he's also played a lot of minutes in these struggling times. And he clearly isn't playing at the absolute best. But Southampton at home is such a good fixture where I'm going to keep him green for this week. And very likely after this week, he's going to drop because I'm sure KDB will eat into his minutes. And generally, as I've said, this season, there's too much depth that they have in interior positions, particularly with Gundo coming back, that I think it is just a general going to be a short to medium term impact on Foden until we're absolutely sure he's going to be back to clocking, 75 to 90 minutes a game as an expectation. If he can be benched versus Wolves away, which I think is still a huge shock to me, then he's not really, a medium-term green pick. But Southampton really is just that good of a fixture that I'm not going to move him for this week. But keep in mind, of course, that I do foresee that Foden will drop immediately after this. As far as players like Son, Palmer, and Saka, I've dropped Saka because I don't really know what the update is on him. I'm sure some people won't believe me and what I have to say on Saka, but I've discussed Walker Gate last season. There was no Saka Gate for me this year. There were no leaks. I just simply decided to make the Saka to Son move myself on Game Week 8, as I indicated within my team selection video, because ultimately I didn't really like the Arsenal fixtures, and I thought there was a bit of upside to go with Son and Spurs. I didn't know that Saka would be out of the squad, but it seems like, of course, we're getting erroneous information from, first of all, Lee Carsley, and second of course, Arteta, as we've seen a couple times over the years. So I don't really know what to do with Saka. I think the easiest way is simply put Arsenal have a Champions League fixture. We can wait for that. We can see whether Saka's in the squad there, and that can give us an indication of whether he's going to make it for the Liverpool match potentially. But the reality is the next 3 games are Liverpool at home, Newcastle away, and Chelsea away. That's 3 poor games. I think that if you can still go on Saka to Son, or maybe even consider downgrading and making some sort of movements in other positions with, like, let's say, double free transfers, I think I would probably do that. And I'd revisit someone like Saka on Game Week 12 when the fixture slate is much cleaner for a team like Arsenal. For Palmer, I think this is a beautiful fixture to jump onto him, particularly if you are in the crowd where you're maybe waiting or have been waiting to go into Palmer. And if you don't want to wait until Game Week 12, I think Game Week 9 is the next best opportunity to go into Palmer. So he's a very, very reasonable pick at this moment in time. With Son, this looks like a beautiful run of fixtures. We know Crystal Palace could still be a tough game. This is an away fixture. And then Aston Villa at home and Ipswich at home, just elite games. What I love crucially about Son is that Game Week 11 is probably versus the worst defense in the league. And you're looking at, or maybe Southampton is, right? Because that's the game that Haaland, the Foden have. But with this Game Week 11 fixture, it's not exactly the best of fixtures for anyone else in the game who's a premium. So when I look at someone like Haaland, for example, who has Brighton away, that's not a great game. When I look at, let's say, someone like Salah, that's Aston Villa at home, which is still a strong game, but nowhere near, I would say, the quality of Ipswich at home for Son. So what I like about Son so much, and why I also went for Son as a Haaland owner, was I was thinking, if I don't own Salah for this run, I really like Son because he's going to be a great Game Week 11 captaincy. And I think that's something when you're looking ahead and thinking about whether, moving off of Saka is worth it, that's why Son is quite important. As far as Salah, I think a lot of people are going to have issues with him still staying yellow. As I said, when I made my move to drop Salah on Game Week 7, I do think that Game Week 10 is the next best opportunity to revisit Salah, and he will be a green there. And I'm staying true to my promise. Next fixture is Arsenal away. That's a very, very tough match, even if, let's say, Saka is still out of the team, because we know how good this Arsenal defense is, at least when they're playing with 11 people and trying to consolidate on a lead, or at least like maximize out of a game. So yeah, that's why Salah is still yellow. But as you guys understand, a lot of the sort of tiers on premiums are based on fixture slates. It's not that I think that Saka is not one of the best players in the game. He absolutely is. And the same as Salah. The same with Salah, sorry. But that's why Salah will rise in next week instead, as opposed to this one. As far as the goalkeepers here, no real changes to the goalkeepers. I think Sells and Kelleher are probably the best value options in the game right now that you can have access to. I've given Pickford a rise. We've seen a much better sort of improved level of performance from Everton over the last few games. The sort of expected goals conceded per game has improved, and we're sort of trending in the right direction after an absolutely abysmal start to the season with injuries and just generally poor play left and right for Everton. So that's why Pickford gets a rise. Martinez also gets a rise. I've actually been very shocked to find out that Aston Villa have been second in the league table by quite a comfortable margin on expected goals conceded. And a lot of people will probably, not really think about this because ultimately they've lost a lot of clean sheets. But I think this is a really good metric to sort of suggest how strong and how robust this Aston Villa team have looked under Unai Emery. And part of this are changes like, bringing in Onana to the team and generally, I guess, improvement across the board within the squad. And Tielemans, for example, even maybe the control of the game, things like that. So that's been a really big improvement for Aston Villa. And therefore, I think Martinez just deserves some credit from that. Raya, still a top option. Ederson probably arguably could be a yellow pick as well. I still think that the only reason why I don't like Ederson so much is because I always value going for someone like Ederson as maybe your fourth best city option, because I always like maybe leaving room for a Haaland, a Foden, and maybe some of the even more attacking defenders at any point in time for Man City. So that's the goalkeepers. I know I've actually switched things up a little bit for this week with the cheat sheet, but this is just to keep you on your toes. Let's quickly move back into the forwards and cover another set of attackers. So the only changes in the 5.x position is that I've given Raul Jimenez another rise. Andreas missing the penalty finally confirms that he's on penalties. I have to say I made a mistake in the previous video. I said that Jimenez is probably on pens. And this was because I was listening to Marcus Silva talk about the last time he took a penalty, and he mentioned that that can change game to game. My assumption was when you have a player take a penalty that he scored, you probably change your mind on that. And I thought Jimenez would take penalties after that. But he let Andres take a penalty. Andres just missed the penalty. I would find it very, very, very hard to believe that Jimenez is not on penalties. And you know what? If he's still not on penalties, then that's surprising to me. But this is a man who is 9-0 in penalties and just literally on absolutely red hot molten form and with really, really good underlying numbers as well. So that's why Jimenez gets a big fat rise. Vardy still ultimately has a good fixture run and I think deserves to be around here. A elite finisher as well over the course of his career. So I think when you look at things like the expected goal involvement, players like Delap, that's quite low still, but maybe the reality is a good finisher. He's a young player, so it's hard to say, I guess, over the tail of his career, what's going to happen. But Vardy, we know what he's brought to the table so far. Evan Nilsson still over a tough run of games, and Strand Larsen easing into much better fixtures, particularly on 10-11. So that's why he gets a rise. He's not on pens though, which is separate from some of the other players in the field. We seemingly got some minutes over the weekend, and I think we're going to see him get back to full match fitness very, very shortly, which is why he's only a differential for now. And I would get him in, even though Ipswich at home is such a good fixture, I'm not so sure if he's going to start again in Game Week 9. So I do think that there's unfortunately a missed opportunity here if you're someone who's actually interested in Wisa, but I just can't guarantee that he's going to start. And I think that's going to be why I'm a little bit slower on moving Wisa back up the board, even though the fixture is so good. As far as Cunha, he gets a rise too. The penalty taker of Wolves, probably worth the extra premium price point. Wood, just absolutely world class on 5 goals. Has definitely overperformed a little bit this season, but I mean, you just have to give credit to someone who's that consistent. Calvert-Lewin, the expected goal involvement was absolutely amazing versus Ipswich, but continues to be a poor finisher. The reality is Calvert-Lewin over the course of his career has been a poor finisher, and I think to give context to that, he has scored, I think, around 78% of his sort of XG. So he's underscored his XG by that much. So it's not necessarily the case that every sort of chance that Calvert-Lewin gets, he's probably going to score half the average chance. But yeah, the reality is, I guess not all XG is the same. His fixture run is still very, very good. So I would still expect that Calvert-Lewin is going to revert to the mean in a sense and still score some goals over this fixture run, or at least I hope so, because he's still in my FPL team. But that's sort of the tail of the tape of Calvert-Lewin. Good underlying stats so far this season, much better minutes this season than any other season in the past. Probably as close to full fitness as he has ever has been over the last 2-3 years. And you just have to imagine that hopefully over this run of games, which includes Southampton Game Week 10, that he's going to deliver something to FPL managers, and I still think he will. As far as Solanke, he's looked very, very dry so far as a pick. The underlying stats are still decent, but not amazing. However, the minutes are good, and the fixture run is still good. If I was a Solanke owner, I would definitely just give him at least up until game week 11, and then I would reconsider, my stance on Solanke, because you can probably just wait for, let's say, Solanke to Jackson on game week 12, or you can even wait for Solanke to Havertz on game week 12 as well. When I look at the next 3 fixtures, yes, of course, Chelsea do have one good game very clearly in Newcastle at home, but you can probably still wait and you still give Dominic Solanke, I think, the chance for Ipswich at home, and that's probably how I'd assess the fixture slate, which is why Havertz has also gotten a drop, which is part of that sort of Arsenal fixture run changing a little bit here. As far as other changes, we have Isak still exactly where he is, and Watkins and Haaland too. Much better game for Watkins here, but overall, as I said in the previous video, the overall run is going to be a bit tougher. Underlying stats for Watkins has been really, really good so far, but you can already see that players like Jackson, like Solanke, like Havertz have already sort of matched him in terms of the expected goal involvement per 90. And it's not necessarily the case that Watkins is a pure 90-minute player so far this season. We know he also has to rotate for the Champions League, so that's going to be quite a big impact in terms of how you assess Watkins. And I do think that if you haven't sold him already after game week 9, it's probably another good opportunity to reconsider selling Watkins. As far as rounding off the cheat sheet here with the defense, the only change that I have for defense is, I think, just once again, when you move off of some of the key big fixtures for the players, you'll see big shifts. And of course, if there's an immediate good fixture, quite a big shift for a lot of these sort of rotation heavy or supporting 4.5 picks within the game. So Mykolenko rises because he's now back to full fitness. He was able to play the previous game. When I recorded the last cheat sheet, I wasn't sure about whether he was going to be available for the last fixture. Now it seems like he's actually okay and ready to play. So Mykolenko does rise. Ait-Nouri also rises because the fixture run is getting much better for Wolves in the short term. As far as Aina Milinkovic, still a really, really good defense. Just like Sells, for example, definitely a top tier defense for the sort of price point. Pinnock with an amazing elite fixture here. So just a very, very good pick in general. Van de Ven with a great fixture run still. And Lewis with a great fixture run still. Lewis is someone that I think a lot of people will feel a little bit peeved by because, yes, you're owning a Man City defender. You want clean sheets. He hasn't got clean sheets so far. But I still have to point out that his underlying stats are still very, very strong. So I don't think that we should completely shut off Lewis when we're still opening our eyes to, for example, other picks within the game that actually have pretty good underlying or no underlying stats even, but still play for a strong defense. Ultimately, the City expected goal conceded numbers have not been that bad so far. They're still top 5, top 6 within the league on defense, and I'm sure it could average in a better direction, even though they are still Rodri-less and arguably struggling without Rodri in terms of actually discovering how to defend to the sort of top standard that they have been performing at over the last few years. So all that being said, Lewis still appears in really, really good and promising positions, and I still think he's a very top pick for the price point. Dunk gets a huge rise. Wolves at home is just an elite game, but after that, the 2 next fixtures are poor. Davis gets a drop because Everton at home on paper was a great fixture. Underlying stats for the game was decent. I think he averaged something like 0.22. So it's really consistent for Davis this season. But as I said, he does drop because, of course, fixtures are moving towards a little bit of a worse direction for Ipswich. As far as, let's say, Colwell, this is a great game, but still generally the fixture run I'd much prefer from a Chelsea defensive perspective from game week 12 and beyond. With Robinson, someone in the comments actually pointed out that I probably was being a bit unfair on Robinson. I didn't actually think about Robinson because I was thinking about Fulham, being a good defense this season and having improved, but still thinking that the Aston Villa game last week was a poor game on paper. But ultimately, the Fulham run is still quite good for the most part. When you look at the next 6 fixtures, there's probably only one severely bad one in there. So that's why I've given Robinson a rise, and I think that's justified. Pau Torres gets, an introduction to the cheat sheet. One thing with Pau Torres is ultimately he's just a center back. So when there's such a good expected goals conceded team, it actually might make sense to just play and rotate some of these players when you're confident at the level of the Aston Villa defense. So that's why he's always going to be here, even though the fixtures aren't that good. As far as Justin, I'm still, once again, unconvinced about the level of that Leicester defense, even compared to the likes of, let's say, Ait-Nouri and Davis, where they're also playing for poor defenses. But crucially, as I said, Justin is someone who also has worse underlying stats than the likes of Davis and the likes of Ait-Nouri. So that's why I still have that sort of separation of these players. As far as Guehi, I'm still not very convinced with the Crystal Palace defense, even at the price point that he's at. So that's why he's where he is. And then actually the other big changes within the cheat sheet are Udogie actually getting included within the cheat sheet. I think he's a really, really top option for the short term. The issue with him is always going to be about his medical fitness and his injury proneness. If you are any worried about that at all over this run, I mean, it could be a problem, but if you're going to get Udogie and you can actually get him playing over the next 3 fixtures, then that's incredible value for what he can provide to the table. As far as Konate, he gets a small drop, and that's just an interim drop because the fixtures, I do think for Liverpool for the next 3 games are quite poor, but I'm sure Konate will shoot back up to the top very, very shortly. And the same applies to, let's say, a lot of the Arsenal defenders who aren't Gabriel still. Porro, top pick. I think he just had so many good chances in the West Ham game. Eventually, he's going to score some of those chances, and he continues to take them, which I think is the most important thing. As far as, let's say, Gabriel Guardiola, I still hold them as absolute top options. Saliba is suspended for the Liverpool fixture. So that's going to obviously be a negative impact, but ultimately you probably wouldn't have been looking to play Saliba versus Liverpool. So if you own him, I think this is a chance to consider moving off of Saliba. At the same time, it's also an opportunity to just assess whether you actually have a defense to cover this Liverpool fixture, and maybe you can actually continue to play Arsenal defense in the future. So that's really up to you as a manager, and whether you want to switch gears into players like Guardiola or Porro, or if you already have them, maybe actually even cutting down on cost and then actually moving into other positions in FPL. With Robertson, Van Dijk, White, I still think that they're definitely differential picks. I do think Tsimikas will still be able to play minutes in the future. It might be the case that Tsimikas plays in the Champions League and Robertson's Premier League minutes are perfect, but as we've already seen one time this season already, that's not going to be a guarantee. So that's why Robertson is still at the sort of position that he's at. I still think if you own Robertson as a player, you probably wouldn't be looking to play him necessarily versus Arsenal, but even fixtures after that, you can sort of assess based on where the rotation is happening with Tsimikas as to which fixture Robertson is likely to play. As far as Trent, he still looks like an absolutely incredible pick in the game. Liverpool have been the best defense so far. That's absolutely true. Underlying stats pretty consistent with let's say, the previous season. And for me, I would say that Trent is just going to rise back to a green pick as soon as game week 10, just like his buddy and friend Mo Salah on the right-hand side. So that's going to be the game week 9 cheat sheet. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys